And again, this is government cooperation without coercion. You can have actually, without formal government, you can have governance. Because you can have cooperation at the scale to where the areas that you agree on are coordinated and planned accordingly. And I don't expect that the country will take up the Portland model of regional government, which is Portland, Oregon, for those in planning know this well, has really the only full-on, formal, unified, single metropolitan government with a single person elected in leadership of that. They are like mayor of the whole metropolis. And nobody else, no other region has followed that pattern, where they have agreed to integrate at that scale and that intimately across that larger scale of space in all these different areas of resource allocation. There's been city-county integration, there's been revenue sharing in places like Minneapolis, and so on. But nobody really is following that model. Instead, what I see is that in certain select areas, economic development, transportation, I'll get to environment in a second, you're seeing a lot more engagement across these spaces. And it's self-interest. It's not engagement that is necessarily, induced by federal policy, although some of it could be in certain areas like transportation. It's more that regions that saw themselves as direct competitors are realizing in a global space that their shared assets probably constitute a larger scale and a greater case for global integration than they do as separate pieces. And so it is one that is voluntary at this stage of the game. And all it is at this moment is a lot of talking across really metropolitan planning organizations, economic development organizations, and so on. The next area, I'll say this and then I'll go to Q&A and answer any of the questions you have on any of this methods or application. The last area is environment, and this is a serious concern because at this scale, metropolitan areas are having the most environmental impact. The idea of developing the entire spine across central Florida with its giant aquifer and all of its fragility, all of its environmental fragility, is something that's sobering. And the U.S., after all, is still growing. The U.S. is on track. Despite this recession, despite the fact that immigration is down and birth rates are down, this country is on track to go, first off, over 30 million in this last decade, which is ahead of the projection. We were projected on the middle range to get to 300 million people by 2010. We got there in spring 2006. And we'll be at 310 to 11 million, which was the high estimate for the census for 2010. To 2040, it looks like we'll take another 100 million people on, or 90 million people on. So we'd go from 300 million in 2006 to 400 million people by 2039 to 2043, somewhere in that range. And it slides further out based on the endurance of the recession. But no matter what, it's a lot of people. It's bigger than all of Germany, which is the largest European Union country, plopped down on top of the United States. Mostly in its megapolitan areas, of which there are about 20 to 25, most of which is 4 million people, 5 million people, 10 million people at scale. And so this is a tremendous amount of growth. And just to put it in perspective, only 2 countries, according to the UN, exceed the US in achieving the next 100 million people. It is actually India and Pakistan. China has a one-child policy, and that's had its effect. By actually mid-21st century, the US may have more babies per year than China. The biggest generation of kids right now is the generation of kids, if you look at even college admissions and things like that and the pressures on it, are actually the millennials, they're called. And it's kids being born in the last several years to about 10 years ago, and there's actually more of them than the baby boom. Luckily, because the baby boom can retire, and contrary to all the heated and crazy rhetoric on it, the US workforce, which is right now 62% of people are engaged in work. The rest are not, based on age, based on who's a kid and who's an adult, who's elderly, rather. In the worst year of the baby boom's retirement, it's 59% engaged in the workforce. 61, 62, thereabouts, 59. In other words, the US does not face a European-style demographic meltdown because the US has allowed high immigration. It has had traditionally higher birth rates. The vast majority of this immigration is acculturated, contrary to the heat and rhetoric of the moment politically. And it is not Europe, which in 2030 could resemble some large-scale assisted living facility with an angry and unassimilated Middle Eastern population that has never been brought into the fold as the caregivers, quite frankly. But the U.S. also faces the burden of accommodating so much of this growth. Now, when we went from 200 million people in 1967 to 300 million people in 2006, the vast share of that growth occurred on greenfield development. In other words, most of it was metropolitan extension. In fact, there are places that didn't even grow, like Cleveland, that much, and still consumed space because of a pattern of development that was favored by public policy through everything from home mortgage deductions to federal interstate policy, you name it, whatever. The likelihood is that given the scale of metropolitan growth, look at a region like this. Where are you going to go? If South Florida is going to grow, it ain't going that way. It isn't going to the Everglades. It's done. Whatever the sawgrass is, I guess it's that direction, right? You can go north. That's the only direction you can go. You could, like a big tube of toothpaste squeezed at the bottom, you could go all the way up to Orlando. Which way am I facing? North is that way. Where's the ocean? All right, you can't go. Remember the eastward ho? I love that eastward ho thing. You have to go eastward ho. This region is, I'm turned around in this building. I think the staircase did it to me. Is that what that is out there? I'm from the west now. I don't know what that looks like anymore. This region's out of land. Southern California is out of land. It's up against, it's a coastal shelf. It's up against mountains and desert. So there are regions in this country where if they were to add 10 or 20 or 30% more population, they would have to take it in the form of infill redevelopment, especially grayfield redevelopment of shopping with large parking lots. My colleague, Chris Nelson, who I'm writing this book with, which will come out in 2011, APA Press, always plug the book. We submitted the first draft. Chris is convinced that all of this could be accommodated on parking lots in dying malls. I'm not so convinced. But some large share of it could be. In other words, there's lots of, these regions are low FAR. These regions are, not developed high density. And as a result, we'll be remaking a lot of the suburban space that was originally carved out 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So my sense is that going forward, we will not have as big a footprint because of change in tastes, environmental regulation, reality, energy, and so on, and that the next 100 million people, some very large share of that, and in certain regions, it could be the majority share, Southern California, South Florida, the largest share of that growth will occur by remaking the existing urban space in a way that's more mixed use, more fine grained mixed use, higher density. Dallas, they could go all the way to the Oklahoma border, and they probably will. That's just Dallas. But every region's going to go its own path, but any region on the scale I'm talking about has immense environmental problems, and water being one of the big ones of those, which is securing and identifying and making sure that you're not in conflict. And this is east and west. I mean, you look at a place like Atlanta, it would seem to rain a lot there, but it has no aquifer. It's in a small watershed. It borrows the water out of a federal dam designed for flood management and energy generation. It would like to get the Tennessee River, but they claim some drunk mismeasured the northern Georgian border, and as a result, they've been cut off from the Tennessee River, and so on and so on. The region I'm living in, I had somebody come to Lake Mead with me and walk up to the lake from Southern California and say to me, "Boy, it looks like you're having a drought here." And I said, "Where do you think the water goes from this lake?" And they said, "Las Vegas." I said, 2%. See that cove? That's Las Vegas's water. Las Vegas gets less water than the turf grass industry in the Imperial Valley is a bigger allocated share. It's going to you. That's your lake. That's your lake. And that's everybody's lake all around these parts. And you're in a common, here in this region, you're in a giant aquifer that extends all the way up into Georgia. And we have done crazy things. Like at the heart of one of the key points in this aquifer, Orlando had some messy industry that took out the central part of it. And we're doing things like natural gas exploration where we're doing fracking underground and introducing benzenes and all kinds of things into aquifers. And this is in, our needs for energy generation are in competition for, water supply. This is what we need to balance at this scale. In other words, megapolitan scale seems at minimum the scale at which you would require water resource management. I would even argue larger. I would argue whole sections of the country, southeast, southwest. You know, the Southwest already is in a common shared agreement because of the requirements of the aridity and the fact that the Colorado is allocated the way it is. But the Southeast has been really sloppy with this. And it's been sort of benefiting by the fact that it's been in a humid environment and has had tremendous amounts of water resources in the past. But given the metropolitan scale, given the expansiveness of this, we're looking at a whole new regime. And with that, I think I'll take a few questions. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you. Well, I want to start with some comments about Professor Lan's remarks and some questions. Professor Lan gave us a very good overview about megaregion development and its new names, combined statistical areas. And I took it the several important points that I think we should think about, and I have some questions about it. And one is what is a good way to make the connections between different regions? Transportation in the forms of high-speed rail seems like it's one of the answers to it. But there are some doubts also, especially from some politicians, about what exactly the high-speed rail play in terms of forging the combination of different economic development in different regions. Is there any hard fact, evidence that showing the establishment of high-speed rail that really promote the regional cooperations in the United States and any part of the world? So I will probably start with that question. Professor Lan to answer that from his own research and experience.
Let me start out by saying, you know the economist Robert Samuelson? Paul Samuelson's son, who has a column in the Washington Post. Does anyone read Robert Samuelson? Robert Samuelson, stop writing about high-speed rail. Please, stop now. You know nothing of the United States, apparently. I feel like taking Robert Samuelson on some reality tour where he comes with me into the high-density parts of the United States. Robert Samuelson argues that the United States, unlike Europe, cannot do high-speed rail because we have such low-density development in our metropolitan areas. Now, I'm a guy who wrote a book called Edgeless Cities. You don't have to tell me about low-density development. All right, that's not the point. The point is this. We have large-scale, higher-density metropolitan areas. This region down here, look at the lot sizes down here. Compare this to Atlanta. Atlanta is a giant, sprawling, greenhouse-belching mess of a metropolis. And this region is using land by requirement, by the way, a lot of the West does this as well, much more efficiently because there's a limited land supply down here, in part. And so there's a tradition of fairly high density, single-family detached, not much benefit for the density that you have because there's not a lot of walkability, there's not a fine grain of mixture of uses. But in a spatial sense, this is not consuming a lot of space. It really never had the space to consume. And this is not that uncommon a region. In other words, there are parts of the United States that have relatively high density that are in transition to a more mixed-use development pattern, and in the process are going to add we're going to add almost 100 million people to this space. We're going to add about 80 million people to the megapolitan space in the next 30, 40, 50 years. So it's not like we're done growing. It's not like the growth pattern that we've established in the post-war years looks like it's that sustainable in an outward expansive sense. And so you get these authors that write things like, did you know that the density of San Bernardino County is one person per every whatever? San Bernardino County is 20,000 square miles. 99% of it lives in the southwest corner of the county, south of Cajon Pass, south of the San Gabriels. The measure, Mr. Samuelson, is the amount of any metropolitan population living in the urbanized space, which is 1,000 people per square mile or more, which is the bottom threshold for providing urban services.